The day began like any other for Mr. Richard Holmes, the manager of a prestigious downtown bank. The sunlight reflected brightly off the bank's grand marble facade as Richard prepared himself for another day of serving affluent clients, each interaction reinforcing his sense of authority and control in the financial world. Then she arrived. Her tall frame and poised demeanor immediately caught the attention of everyone in the lobby. Dressed in a tailored business suit and holding an elegant leather briefcase, she exuded confidence as she approached the counter. "Good morning. I'd like to deposit this check into my account," she said smoothly, extending the check to the young cashier. The cashier glanced at the amount, her eyes widening slightly. It was an imposing six-figure sum. Regaining her composure, she leaned forward and said softly, "Ma'am, this is quite a large amount. I'll need to direct you to our manager." The woman nodded calmly, her expression unwavering, and followed the cashier's gesture toward the office. "Mr. Holmes, there's a client here with a substantial check," the cashier announced as she stepped into Richard's office. Richard glanced up from his desk, his expression turning rigid as his eyes settled on the visitor. Years of experience told him she wasn't the typical customer for this branch. Masking his assumptions with a thin veneer of professionalism, he greeted her. "How can I assist you?" he asked curtly, barely making eye contact. "I'm here to deposit this check into my account," she replied evenly. Placing the check on his desk, Richard picked up the document and scrutinized it, his lips tightening as suspicion flashed across his face. "This is quite a large sum," he muttered. "I'll need to verify the source of these funds." "Standard procedure. All the necessary documentation and contact details are listed on the check," she replied in an even tone. "You're welcome to confirm everything with my legal team." "Even so," Richard countered, his reluctance palpable, "I'll need additional verification. Perhaps you could provide further evidence of your business's legitimacy." The woman raised her eyebrows slightly but maintained her composure. "My business complies fully with the law. You have all the information you need to process this without delay." Richard leaned back in his chair, his voice hardening. "I decide how and when transactions are processed here," he said, his tone sharp enough to draw the attention of several employees who peeked out from behind their desks. Sensing the rising tension, the young cashier, Sophie, hesitantly intervened. "Mr. Holmes, I've seen this client before. She's conducted significant transactions with us in the past. Her name is familiar." "Sophie, you're dismissed," Richard snapped, turning back to the client. "If you have a problem, you can file a complaint. However, I reserve the right to investigate any check I deem suspicious." The woman sighed softly, maintaining her steady demeanor. "Very well. If you can't process this transaction, I'll escalate the matter to the bank's leadership. I'm sure they'll be interested in your approach to these investigations." "Listen, Miss," Richard deliberately avoided using her name, though it was clearly printed on the documents before him. "I'm just following protocol. Verifications are mandatory for sums of this size. I understand your concern for protocol, Mr. Holmes, but I'm confident this delay does not align with the bank's standards," she replied icily, her hands resting firmly on her briefcase. "You have all the documents you need. So what's the issue?" Richard hesitated, his tone taking on a defensive edge. "The issue is that amounts like this aren't typical for clients like you. Do you understand?" Her eyes narrowed momentarily, but she maintained her calm exterior. Without a word, she retrieved her phone and began dialing. "Fine. If you can't handle this, I'll contact someone who can." Seeing the situation escalate further, Sophie approached Richard one last time, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "Mr. Holmes, I'm confident her account is in excellent standing. She's one of our major depositors and has completed similar transactions in the past." Richard waved her off with irritation. "Enough. Focus on your work. This isn't your concern." Blushing with embarrassment, Sophie cast an apologetic glance at the client before stepping back. Meanwhile, the woman was speaking calmly but firmly into her phone. "Yes. Connect me to the executive team, please. It's urgent. I'm encountering an issue with a check at one of your branches." "Thank you." Richard's confidence faltered slightly. but he tried to maintain control of the situation. "Whoever you're calling," he said, attempting to sound authoritative, "will tell you the same thing. Verification is mandatory, and I can't bend the rules." At that moment, the office door swung open, and a sharply dressed, middle-aged woman stepped inside. It was Catherine Lewis, the bank's regional director. Her expression was a sharp blend of irritation and professional authority. "What's happening here?" she demanded, her piercing gaze scanning the room. Richard stood up, visibly startled. "Catherine, I wasn't expecting you. We're just conducting a routine check on a substantial transaction." "A check?" Catherine's eyes shifted to the client, and her stern expression softened instantly. "Mrs. Harper, my apologies. I didn't know you were here. Is there an issue?" The client, now identified as Mrs. Harper, glanced at Richard and then back at Catherine. Her voice was composed, but her words carried weight. "It seems Mr. Holmes has decided my check requires extra scrutiny. Apparently, his concerns are not about the amount but something else." Catherine narrowed her eyes, the implication clear. "Richard, you are aware of who our clients are, correct?" Her voice turned frigid. "Of course," he stammered, visibly uneasy. "I just wanted to ensure everything was in order." "That's enough." Catherine cut him off. "Mrs. Harper, your transaction will be processed immediately. Please wait in the lounge. I'll oversee everything personally." As Mrs. Harper left the office, her eyes lingered on Richard for a brief moment, a glance that spoke volumes. It was evident this matter was far from resolved. Catherine turned back to Richard. "I was only trying," Richard began, but Catherine raised her hand sharply to silence him. "You just made a serious mistake," she said, her voice slicing through the room. "And there will be consequences." Richard's face turned pale as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Catherine escorted Mrs. Harper to the conference room, offering her a glass of water and assuring her the matter would be addressed promptly. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his office, cold sweat trailing down his back. He knew he had blundered catastrophically, and now his career hung in the balance. Desperately, he began concocting excuses. Minutes later, Catherine returned to his office, her stern demeanor unyielding. "Richard, do you even realize who you were speaking to?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "A client with a questionable check." Richard replied flatly, clinging to his facade of authority. "Am I not supposed to verify large amounts?" Catherine smirked, though her eyes remained ice-cold. "Questionable? That check came directly from her corporate account. Now, let me ask you, why did you think verification was necessary? Is this standard procedure for all clients? Or did you make a special exception? Let me remind you who Mrs. Harper is. She's the largest shareholder in this bank. She holds a controlling stake and, if she wanted to, could fire you with a single phone call." Richard froze, his face drained of color as if his sentence had just been pronounced. This must be a mistake," he whispered. "I couldn't have known." "You should have," Catherine replied coldly. "And do you know what makes this worse? It wasn't just a mistake. You let your biases cloud your judgment. That's unacceptable." Meanwhile, in the conference room, Mrs. Harper calmly reviewed her documents, though her sharp eyes betrayed her thoughts. A soft knock interrupted her focus, and Sophie entered, carrying a glass of water and a folder. "Mrs. Harper, I'm sorry to disturb you," Sophie said hesitantly, "but I just wanted to thank you for your patience." Mrs. Harper smiled warmly. "Thank you, Sophie. I noticed you tried to step in earlier. That says a lot about your character." As Sophie left, Mrs. Harper retrieved her phone and dialed a number. Her voice, firm and decisive, filled the room. "Janet, it's Eleanor Harper. I need you to assemble the leadership team. We're going to discuss management practices at one of our branches." "Yes, this is urgent." Back in the conference room, Catherine returned, her tension evident. "Mrs. Harper, everything has been processed. Please accept my sincerest apologies for the inconvenience." Eleanor stood, gathering her documents. Her voice was steady but firm. "You're not at fault, Catherine, but I can't allow this to happen again in my bank. We will be having a serious discussion." As she exited the branch, staff and clients watched her departure in respectful silence. Richard, standing frozen by his office window, could only watch helplessly as his career crumbled before his eyes. The next day, Eleanor Harper sat at the head of a sleek conference table in the bank's headquarters. Surrounding her were key figures of the management team, including Catherine Lewis, visibly tense, and Richard Holmes, desperately clinging to the remnants of his dignity. Eleanor began, her voice calm yet firm. Yesterday's incident at your branch wasn't just an error. It exposed a deeper systemic issue. As the largest shareholder in this bank, I have a responsibility to address this. Her gaze turned to Catherine. Catherine, you're a professional, but it's your responsibility to ensure that all branches uphold principles of respect and equality. What happened yesterday is unacceptable. Eleanor's tone was unwavering as she continued. Catherine nodded in agreement, but Richard couldn't stay silent. Mrs. Harper, please let me explain. It was standard procedure. I didn't mean. Eleanor raised her hand, silencing him. Richard, don't try to justify yourself. Your so-called standard procedures were arbitrary and biased. You ignored my documents, acted on prejudice, and failed to perform your duties. This isn't about following protocols. It's about your attitude. Eleanor's gaze made him stop. She turned her attention to the rest of the management team. This bank relies on the trust of its clients. If we allow incidents like this to continue, that trust will erode. This isn't just about Richard. It's a systemic issue. That's why I'm proposing specific, actionable changes. Eleanor placed a set of documents on the table. First, mandatory staff training focused on principles of inclusion and cultural competence. Second, a comprehensive review of internal procedures to eliminate bias. Third, the creation of an internal mechanism for handling complaints from both clients and employees. These changes will be implemented within a month. The room filled with murmurs as the management team discussed her proposal. Catherine was the first to speak up. This is necessary. We cannot let incidents like this damage our reputation. Eleanor turned to Richard, her expression steely. Richard, you understand you cannot remain in your position after what happened yesterday, don't you? Richard's face turned pale, and he remained silent. Resistance was futile, and he knew it. You have a choice. Resign with a letter of recommendation or face an internal investigation. I suggest you choose wisely, Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. By the end of the meeting, Eleanor left feeling a sense of progress. However, she knew there was still more to be done. Later that afternoon, Eleanor returned to the branch where the incident had occurred. Sophie noticed her and hesitantly stepped forward. Mrs. Harper, it's good to see you, Sophie said softly. Eleanor gave her a warm smile. Sophie, I noticed your courage in trying to intervene earlier. That's an admirable quality. If you're interested in advancing your career, reach out to me. This bank needs employees like you. Sophie blushed at the unexpected praise, a shy smile spreading across her face. As Eleanor walked out of the building with her head held high, staff and clients looked on with quiet admiration. This wasn't just her bank anymore. It had become a symbol of how one person's resolve could change an entire system.